Well, here we are. The Canadian Grand Prix has come and gone, and we're here to talk about it. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're here to talk about the 2024 Canadian Grand Prix, and boy was it wet and wild, and then wet again, and then wild again, all the way down the final stretch. We saw Max Verstappen return to the top step of the podium, and up and down the order we saw a lot of things happen, some good, some bad, some just pure head scratchers, and we're here to talk about everything that we going on. We're going to talk about our weekend quick hits, our weekend winners and losers, and then we'll go over the predictions that I made before the weekend began, and we'll see just how I did. Let's get things started with our quick hits, and boy, we gotta start with, I think, the key thing that happened over the course of this whole weekend, but specifically the race, which was the fact that we got a wet to dry to wet to dry race, which got us exactly what we all dream of. An actual strategy race. That's right, it was not just a bog standard one stop with maybe a two stop thrown in there. That ultimately doesn't work out, and so we just see basically after the pit stops are over, that's basically all she wrote. We saw a lot of differing strategies over the course of this race, none more so, I think, different than the very beginning of the race, which will start with our Haas master plan to eventual disaster plan. But we'll start with the absolute vibe that was the first 7 laps of this race, where both Haases started on the full wet tires while the rest of the grid started on the intermediates, and we saw it work to perfection for about 6 to 8 laps, depending on how you want to look at it. We saw Kevin Magnussen make his way all the way up to P4, and Nico Hülkenberg all the way up into P8, I believe, before ultimately the track crossover started and the full wets decided they didn't want to work quite as well as they were before. But this was a vibe and a half for me as a Haas fan, because I will be riding the high of that first stint until the rest of the season, probably. Obviously, if something crazier happens and good things happen for us, I'm not going to say no. But the absolute vibe was of watching the Haas's just carve through the field will be fueling me the rest of the season, no matter what. Now, we should have seen the downfall coming when Kevin Magnussen encountered an 8.6 second pit stop. And I mean, that really was the end of that one. Ultimately, Nico decided to stay out and risk it, and then ultimately just fell back down the order. Obviously, they did end up finishing P11 and 12 on track, but that's a good result. But at the same time, it was a hard crash back down to earth after how exciting it was to watch those first few laps. So I'm not complaining, but at the end of the day, it is still a little frustrating to finish P11 and 12 and just wonder what could have happened, you know? Let's head back to the top of the grid. Max Verstappen, who did not technically take pole position this weekend, finishing P2 in qualifying behind George Russell, who, when they set identical times, but George Russell setting his lap time before Max. So George Russell takes his first pole position of the year, and Mercedes' first pole position in probably quite a long time. But ultimately, Max comes out on top, and yeah, is what it is, I guess. There's definitely some what ifs going up and down the grid in a few teams. We're going to touch on some of them, but Max was back out in front, and nothing was going to slow him down once he got there. For as good as it went for Max in this race, we have to talk about the absolute Ferrari disaster class. I mean, Ferrari coming off fresh off of the win in Monaco and a double podium in Monaco, followed up just 2 weeks later with a double DNF from this one, with Charles Leclerc encountering a power unit issue before ultimately retiring the race, especially after some very odd strategy calls, which involved putting him on the hard tire with the rain coming down, which ultimately put him a lap down, and at the same time, that was basically his race done in there. And then Carlos Sainz ends up making a mistake and spinning off, collecting Alex Albon in the process, and he ends up retiring from this one as well. And so, yeah, Ferrari, let's not do it again, all right? I think the biggest what if of the weekend, or at least the race, is definitely going to go to the Papaya Boys of McLaren. During the first, moments of real strategy decision of going on to the slicks, where they left Lando out a couple of laps, I think, too long. They tried to continue to hold that pit stop gap, but completely forgot about the fact that the pit exit had not seen that much running, and the water had still been piled up in the pit exit. And Lando, obviously, it was going to be a very tight exit with Max coming through. Ultimately, Lando did his best, but there was no traction to be had, and ultimately Max took the lead, and that was basically all she wrote there. So I do wonder what would have happened had McLaren kind of just followed suit a little earlier. It would have been a little tight, but at least they would have still been a little more in sync, and it may not have come down to quite being so tight on pit exits and a wet track. So I do wonder what would have happened. Lando showed very good pace, and as well as Oscar actually showed good pace as well to round out for them. But Oscar, I think, got a little unlucky with his timing and where he ended up on the track at what time, because he ended up having to tussle with George Russell, which ultimately kind of pulled him a little further down the order, and he ended up finishing behind both Mercedes in the end. So it is definitely a big what if for McLaren. I do think a win was on the cards, but I think you could say that about a few teams this weekend. Speaking of another team that might have some what ifs to their name, let's talk about Mercedes. Obviously gets their first pole position of the year with George taking pole. Lewis ends up qualifying down in P7, but actually set the second fastest time in qualifying, but it just ended up not being, at the right moment to, put that Mercedes where I think it realistically should have been, because they looked very strong all weekend. But at the end of the day, a P3 and a P4 is definitely their best weekend of the year. And while I do think it's important to celebrate that, at the same time, I think it just also goes to show just how far Mercedes has fallen, that a P3 and a P4 is basically the best that they could hope for at this moment. I think they are fairly comfortably the fourth fastest car, and so this actually is a pretty good win for them. But at the same time, there's a lot of what ifs in there. George, said after the race that it was probably one of the worst races he's run. I don't think we can disagree about it too much, but at the same time, you gotta take the wins when you get there, right? And then we'll wrap things up, I think, with the other biggest talking points of this race, which is the 5 DNFs from this race. It started off with Logan Sargent spinning off, causing the first safety car here. Logan struggled in the race. He ended up locking up and making his way to the back before ultimately just getting a snap on the car, and he ends up sliding into the wall and DNFing. Then we obviously had already touched on the double DNF by Ferrari. Alex Albon was collected by Carlos Sainz when Carlos made his DNF. So, Alex also not making it to the checkered flag. And of course, the last DNF was Sergio Perez, which we're not going to touch on too much, but as of the recording of this, he actually has received a 3-place grid drop, and Red Bull was fined 25,000 euros for sending him basically back to the pits with that car banged up as much as he was. And tough weekend for Checo, coming off of a tough weekend at Monaco, coming off of a 2-year extension on his Red Bull contract. There are a lot of questions being asked around Sergio Perez. We're not going to cover that here. We're going to wait and see what he can do next time out, but there's definitely a lot of question marks flying around the Mexican driver at the moment. Let's move on to our weekend winners and losers. We'll begin with our weekend winner, and I mentioned it already, and I actually went back and forth a lot on this one on who I think actually is, the winners of the weekend in general. And while I did mention there was a lot of what ifs surrounding this team, I do think the winner is Mercedes this weekend. Obviously, I do think it's their best weekend by far. A George Russell pole and then finishing P3 and P4, their first podium of the season, I believe, is absolutely nothing to sneeze at. We have seen this from them in the past where they'll put in a good weekend and then they really just can't keep up the momentum. And so it'll be interesting to see what they can do going forward. But at the same time, we got to give them props when they actually do manage to get it right. A pole position in the W15 has to be applauded. And Lewis actually making his way up from P7 to finish in P4 actually is extremely good drive by him, even considering he was stuck behind Alonso for basically most of the race, at least in that bulk middle portion, before he ultimately was able to make his way around Fernando and finish in P4. So absolutely fantastic work. We'll see if they can keep it up, but at least for this weekend, they knocked it out of the park. I also want to give a special shout out to my weekend winner, even though he didn't finish the races, Alex Albon's double overtake into the final chicane. What an absolute beaut of a move, by the way, splitting the difference between the cars and just sending one down the inside and taking the racing line. What an absolute baller move if I've ever seen one. Alex, would do more of that, please, because that was incredible. Let's roll right along into our biggest weekend loser, and I think I can say biggest because boy oh boy did this team really just disappoint after a tough, just really makes you want to pull your hair out after watching it, you know, after 2 weeks basically following Monaco. All people wanted to do was hype up Ferrari about how they could potentially challenge for the constructors title, and they immediately follow it up with a double DNF in Canada. Charles was also only 31 points behind Max in the Drivers' Championship, which was a long shot to say the least. I think a lot of people had their attention focused on the Constructors' title. But yeah, a double DNF by Ferrari after getting all the love in the world after Monaco, especially the way they did it, right? It's the way they did it. It's the power unit issue for Charles. It's the taking 20 seconds in the pit lane to basically restart the computer, which apparently fixed the issue. I still have doubts about that, but apparently that fixed the issue. And then putting him on the hard tires, the hardest compound to actually activate, in the wet as it was just about to start bucketing down rain again in that second rain stint, putting Charles effectively a lap down, a minute behind, which at that point would have been like P18 or whatever it was. He was running around in 19th for a while, and then ultimately getting to a point where they bring him back in and basically just go, we're good, just retire the car. And then obviously Carlos spun on his own, collected an Alex Albon for his troubles, and eventually also just retired the car. Ferrari, do not, please let this be a flash in the pan. You've done so good since Fred Vasseur took over. Please do not revert to your 2022 Benato-ness, all right? Promise me. That wraps up our weekend winners and losers, and now we'll go through our predictions results over the course of the weekend. And it was a slightly tough day for your boy, saved by some clutch predictions that really just made it seem a little less worse than I initially began. Let's start with my pick for biggest positive surprise. I went for Fernando Alonso, and while I do think Fernando had an Aston Martin in 2024 kind of race, Fernando definitely didn't do enough, I think, to give myself a point here for biggest positive surprise. So starting off hot with an offer in terms of biggest positive surprise. And we will continue that trend as we head to my pick for biggest disappointment, which I went for the Canadian of Lance Stroll. I basically went for an opposite, two sides of the same coin type of prediction here. I thought Aston Martin was going to have a very up and a very down weekend. It turns out that was Red Bull, and Lance finished in the points, a double points finish for Aston Martin. Also, definitely not enough to call Lance Stroll even in the conversation for biggest disappointment. So starting off 0-4-2 in my predictions here in Canada. I am saved slightly because of my prediction for Max Verstappen to not take pole position and to start the race in P2. And while he did match George Russell's time for pole position, since George set his time first, Max ends up starting in P2. And so my qualifying predictions were an Oscar Piastri pole, a Max Verstappen V2, and a Charles Leclerc P3. Obviously, Oscar did not qualify in the top three, and Charles didn't even make it into Q3 in qualifying. So the 1 point for Max Verstappen and nailing that position saves me there, 1 out of 3. And we'll move on to my pick for the race podium. Now, here is where I recover the most out of all of my predictions. I predicted a Max Verstappen win. Ding, ding. I did predict a Charles Leclerc P2. Could not have gotten that one more incorrect. And a Lando Norris P3, because I rightly picked that Oscar was going to run into some bad luck and bad timing in this one. But unfortunately, my Charles Leclerc pick for P2 really held me back here from maybe even getting 2 out of 3 here. So a 1.5 points out of 3 for my race podium saves the day a little bit. And we round things out with my one crazy prediction, which was to see Logan Sargent out-qualify Alex Albon on pace. And boy, oh boy, over the course of the weekend, I thought I was cooking here. It was getting my hopes up. Logan makes it into Q2, running very, very well, but misses out on Q3 by, less than 300ths of a second to whoever it was, Carlos Sainz or Charles Leclerc in P11 or 12. He was absolutely on fire and almost made it into Q3, but at the end of the day, Alex qualified P10, Logan qualified P13, and so 0 points there. So at the end of the day, I bring home 2.5 points, bringing my total to 35.5 points over the course of the season. And if we take a look at the running total for our entire competition here, also if you're interested in joining our little competition, head to the link in my description, join the Discord, and I'll call for predictions as we on the road up to a Grand Prix weekend, and we'll have some fun if you're interested in joining. But looking at our running totals here, I currently still lead with 35.5 points, a full point ahead of British TTG, who has 34.5 points, Sentinel 40 with 33.5, and then we still have F1 Inferno down there, who's on slightly less points because he did join for China at 18.5 points. Andrew with 15.5 points, and then Wolf 458 bringing up the rear at 4.5 points. Been a minute since he's made some predictions, but we'll hold his spot for the time being. So that really only leaves the question here of what is next. Formula One heads to Spain to race around the Circuit de Catalunya 2 weeks from now. Last year, we saw a Max Verstappen, Lewis Hamilton, and George Russell podium. That was the weekend last year we saw Mercedes absolutely cooking before they inevitably kind of fell off over the course of the season there. So the only question remaining is, who are we going to see on the podium this year? I think is much more interesting of a question now than ever, as we see Red Bull, specifically Max Verstappen, the two McLarens, and at times two Ferraris. And if Ferrari's not there, you can see that Mercedes is there to put up as much of a fight as they can. So it's going to be really interesting to see what happens here in Spain. I'm a big fan of Spain. I know it's not always, especially I'm interested to see especially now that they've gotten rid of the final chicane. I think it's a very, very interesting layout, and I'm very interested to see what comes next. But guys, if you enjoyed this video, leave a comment down below what you thought of the Canadian Grand Prix. Subscribe if you haven't already, and leave a thumbs up on the video. It really helps me out. I hope you guys enjoyed the video and the Canadian Grand Prix. We'll be back in a couple of weeks for my predictions video for Spain when we get there. But for now, that's going to wrap it up from here, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.